years of biological effort, man alone had seemingly evaded the oblique trap of biological specialization. He had done so by the development of a specialized organ, the brain, whose essential purpose was to avoid specialization.
Let's talk about that a minute, Bing. The brain, now we have a brain. That means that we don't have to specialize, huh? So what do we do with our brain? We misuse it by further specialization.
Exactly.
So, now there's a moment, I don't know whether Isley talks about this or not. I don't think so. But there's a writer who stresses similar themes. His name is Arthur Koestler. And he wrote a book, The Ghost and the Machine. And in this book, he talks about how there was a certain plateau that we reached in our evolutionary history. And then, all of a sudden, for some unpredictable reason, the brain ballooned. And suddenly, you've got this balloon brain, the brain that we have, which, for example, you contrast it with the brain of a dinosaur. The dinosaur has chosen to have a brain the size of a walnut inside 20 tons of armored plate. That's the way he chose. That's the way his future unfolded. But now here we have this brain the size of ours, and presumably it means that we're smart enough not to over-specialize. But the question is, are we using all of this infinite capacity as it could be used?
And as we come into the 20th century, now Isley has set the stage. We have this brain which gives us which from this point on, it is culture and our technology which will clothe and unclothe man, which will feed us. And now we've reached this point where now Isley feels comfortable in coming into the 20th century and talking about the impact of technological civilization, beginning to reminisce and talk about some of these issues. And he starts off by looking at, we here in the United States, and he starts by talking about slime modes, and then he says the United States, representing some 6% of the world's population, consumes over 34% of its energy and 29% of its steel. Over 1 billion pounds, and we're far beyond that now, of trash are spewed out over the landscape in a single year. The future of a planet virus, Homo sapiens, as he assumes in his technological phase what threatens to be his final role. We live in an epoch of localized affluence. A few shifts and subterfuges may, with increasing effort and expense, prolong this affluence, but no feat of scientific leisure man can prevent the eventual exhaustion of the world's mineral resources at a time not very distant. It is thus apparent that to apply to Western industrial man the term world eater is to do so neither in derision nor contempt. We are facing instead a simple reality to which up until recently the only response has been flight, the flight outward from what appears unsolvable and which threatens in the end to leave an impoverished human remnant clinging to an equally impoverished globe. So quick and so insidious has been the rise of the world virus that its impact is just beginning to be felt and its history to be studied. Basically, man's planetary virulence can be ascribed to just one thing: a rapid ascent, particularly in the last 3 centuries, of an energy ladder so great that the line on the chart representing it would be almost vertical. The event in the beginning involved only Western European civilization. Today, it increasingly characterizes most of the planet.
So, once again, you get the elegiac tone. We are what he calls spore bearers, and we are world eaters. That means, for example, Omaha is a spore city. Because, why? We have left the riverfront and we're sprawling, farther and farther to the west. More and more parking lots, more and more paved streets. And it's not just Omaha, it's any great metropolitan community. We're sprawling, and that's what he called spore. We're spore bearers, and he anticipates the time when life will eventually be truncated because we have divorced ourselves from nature. And isn't this interesting? He says, Isley is saying it was better off. We were better off when we worshipped nature deities, like the primitive people, like the Aborigines in Australia, like the Native Americans, like the tribes people of northern Africa and what we now call the Holy Land, the Canaanitish tribes. They worshipped nature. They would not change nature. They would not tamper. Nature was sacred. And Isley, this is very heretical, Loren. If we had you here, we would give you a lecture for this. You are saying that monotheism was not necessarily a good thing. And
Exactly.
while we of the Judeo-Christian tradition point back to Moses as the enunciator and the discloser and the discoverer of the concept of one God, and Isley is saying that's not necessarily all a good thing, because it meant that we were able to detach that one God from creation. And therefore, we became detached from creation, and we began to take what Martin Buber called an I-it attitude toward nature instead of an I-thou attitude toward nature. And that's why we can exploit nature the way we do and have a clear conscience and gouge out the mineral wealth of the world and mow down the rainforests because, after all, it's it and it's not thou.
He now begins to look at technological civilization, and he takes as an example the incident of the New York Great Eastern Power Failure, which occurred some 20-some years ago. He talks about this unfortunate individual who saw an open access and decided he had a candle. And he's so confident in his technology that he never bothered to look at his feet. He just walked into this open access. And fully confident that he was going to find a way out of this technology trap that had been created for him. Not realizing that this was an empty elevator shaft. And Isley then points this empty elevator shaft as the potential trap for human civilization and mankind in general, specifically. And he says, a scientific civilization, in the full sense, is an anomaly in world history. Never before have such large masses of people been so totally divorced from the land or the direct processing of their own foodstuffs. This phenomenon has undoubtedly contributed to the alienation of man from nature, as more and more acres go under cement for parking lots, shopping centers, and superhighways. A steadily mounting population threatens increasing damage to the natural environment from which all food and breathable air are drawn. He talks then about this individual who was in a New York office building. He says, a Negrito or any one of the bush folk would have known better than to go prowling in a spirit-haunted, leopard-infested jungle after nightfall. The forest dwellers would have remained in their huts until daybreak. This episode is symbolic. Man, frail, anticipatory man, no longer possessed the caution to find his way through a disturbance in his nightly routine. Urban man, used to walking on smooth surfaces, had never glanced below his feet. He and his inadequate candle had plunged recklessly.
What's the deal we've made with the devil? Well, the deal is technology. The deal is air conditioning. The deal is thermostatic heat. The deal is we'll buy the cold air from the poles and we'll bring it down here and we'll run it through our houses. We do that really because sooner or later, if we borrow enough of that air, the ice cap is going to melt. So that's the deal we make with the devil. And in the end, the devil doesn't forget who owes him value.
Mm-hmm. Well, I thought you would probably have something to respond to this. The legend of Faust to this day epitomizes the West. The quest of the Holy Grail is another of its Christian symbols. And I thought you would probably enjoy responding to that. Faustian man is never at rest in the world. He is never the contemplative beneath the sacred bow tree of the Buddha. He is instead a spokesman of the will. He is the embodiment of a restless, exploratory, and anticipatory ego. Science could also be said, not irreverently, to be a search for the Holy Grail. And he looks at man's insatiable quest through the guise of the space programs that we've been involved with. And I, as a technologist, became interested in technology and engineering because of this vaunted dream of being involved with space exploration when I was a child growing up in New York. And so I find it very interesting. Man, in retrospect, seems almost predestined for space. To master the dream in its entirety, however, man had to invent in two categories: inventions of power and inventions of understanding. The invention of the scientific method itself began as an adventure in understanding. Inventions of power without understanding have been the bane of human history.
He cites Francis Bacon as the creator of the scientific method. Do you see the scientific method as one of the reasons that we're world eaters? A spore bearer?
He does a very good example. He talks about the Hindus and the Maya inventing the concept of the zero. And he says, well, the Romans, for all their vaunted technology, had a very cumbersome mathematics because they didn't have the zero. And he said, in our time, that necessary zero leaps instantaneously through the circuits of computers, helping to guide a rocket on the long pathway to Mars. One might say that an unknown mathematical genius seeking pure abstract understanding was a necessary prehistoric prelude to the success of the computer. Then he talks about the other side of that. He says he was also tragically the possible indirect creator of world disaster in the shape of atomic war. Traveling long journeys is costly, at all times troublesome, at some times dangerous. They can also be spoken of the scientific journey itself. Today, magnified beyond the comprehension of the ancient wayfarer, we contemplate roads across the planetary orbits, the penetration of unknown atmospheres, and the defiance of solar flares. Into the organization of this endeavor has gone an outpouring of wealth and inventive genius so vast that it constitutes a public sacrifice. And now we're going to get to the Great Pyramid and how this book got to be titled the way it is.